Well, the Golden Age Project is a name I gave to the work I'm doing about 15 years ago in reality, because I had to think that I had the good fortune of meeting again my uncle Christian O'Brien, having asked him questions about where did vegetarians start being vegetarians and how is he getting on with his latest book, etc., etc. And I found myself doing a lot of independent research on a range of subjects, and I thought, what's going to be a good name? And for some reason I chose the Golden Age Project, which becomes more appropriate the more work I do and the more we move forward and look at the past. I didn't know just how important the Golden Age was in the past, and I haven't got to change my name of my research operation, if you like, in terms of the research being carried out on ancient history, which is a continuation, the good fortune of me being provided with a roadmap of time by Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien, and being able to develop their work much further, and more importantly to fully support from other sources their incredible research on the discovery of the Garden of Eden, the sighting of Atlantis and the survey of Atlantis, Baalbek being so important, and much more besides. The genius of the few, in my opinion, is a simple, or the simplest, definitive research on the whole story of religion. It takes in Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, and explains it in simple language about not God in heaven, but the bright ones, or the shining ones in the planted highlands. It confirms all that's there within the secrets of Enoch and the books of Enoch, and Enoch being the great historian who was taken to the planted highlands under the instructions of the great Lord to record all that was going on in the, was called the speedy writing, which was the feather, and the ink type writing, which was the in-house alphabet, as it was called later, of the early peoples of Phoenicia, and all the elite in the ancient world. Ashburnapal in his library was taught the alphabet within his teaching at a kingship school. The Druids used the old in-house alphabet, which was similar to the Greek letters, but the Greek letters came on later. So the whole of that story is confirmed, and the key part of that story is confirmed by the Sumerian Karsag epics, where the Sumerians have, thousands of years before the Bible, recorded in great detail, specific detail, about the people who arrived at the site which O'Brien later identified clearly as southern Lebanon, and we've now seen the overhead images and all the clues and pieces, and it's now being researched, where the Sumerian records had very clearly identified that a small group of people, survivors from the great catastrophe, had to start again with agriculture and civilization. So that book covers all the practical issues, down-to-earth issues that the church has missed out on. The church has used loads of explanations which don't make sense, but as soon as you start looking at the bright ones in the planted highlands farming and producing food, and a very special package of food which was unique and has sustained our civilization till now, and the same seeds and same crops and same domestic animals are still with us. Quite staggering. All arriving around the same place at the same time. This is much more than a miracle. This is something where it had to be an ancient, earlier, advanced civilization starting all over again. Now, in terms of spirituality, it's a difficult word because spirit comes from the word pneuma, which is a Greek word for air. And I'll use spirit because we haven't got a better word for what's going on. But what we find in spirituality is interesting because we find in Egypt at the earliest times of Osiris and Isis people wearing what look like leotards and meditating, and in meditation poses. For example, the cross legs, etc. Very early Egypt. We find that in India, and we find it on in the Celtic, the wonderful, marvellous silver bowl, which is in fact the Druid zodiac, one of the figures, Cernus, of the antlers, is sitting in a meditation position. Now, Jesus helps here too, because in his teachings to his inner circle of disciples, which O'Brien translated the Askew and Bruce codices, and this is the primary source document of what Jesus was talking about, the kind of man he was, the fact that he was teaching men and women, the fact that Mary Magdalene and his mother were playing key roles. And he's talking and teaching what is still taught in some places in India, and it's called the Surat Shabad Yoga. Now, that simply means soul-word union. And we can link that with what was going on in Egypt at the time of Osiris, and everywhere else where there is some kind of sophistication and tradition. So meditating, maybe going out of body, believing there is a soul, believing about the journeys of a soul, which is exactly what Jesus is talking about, this inner advanced knowledge. And we know that the Druids and everybody before we get involved with the Church of Rome, for example, had no difficulty in accepting the transmigration of the soul. Tibetan monks came along much later, and they claimed to be able to go out of body. I've spoken to people who, one or two people who I genuinely believe can go out of body. And so this is a new area of science. We're now told there are 25 or 26 different dimensions, maybe with sound, maybe with meditation, maybe with special skills. We can go out of body. We know that our brain, 6% of the dry matter of our brains, is made up of what are called monatomic elements. And monatomic elements can flip into other dimensions, and maybe that structure within our brain will allow us to do that as well. But there's no direct teaching about spiritualism as such, but there is a direct link to meditation and, if you like, mind control, being at peace with oneself. But my belief is that the ancients got themselves in really good shape by having a fantastic diet, really understanding diet, being able to prolong their lives much longer than we can prolong our lives now. That stored up ancient wisdom was very, very important. And I think that they were able to make far better use of their brains by self-discipline than we are today. So our objective today should be to have wonderful diets, take loads of exercise, see what we can do with our brains, test our brains to the limit in that extent, but don't please try and take the shortcuts which the so-called shaman take and use plants and substances and drugs, because it doesn't work. Or in most cases it simply causes brain damage. And remember, shaman is a derivation of the name Shamash, who was one of the Shining Ones, one of the most important Shining Ones. Ogmash, Shamash goes back to Uta, and we're talking about people who were the people who invented music, the people who were astronomers, the people who were involved in the movements of the sun. They weren't worshipping the sun, they were measuring it, they were doing practical things. And my view is that they were smart enough to know that if you make use of your brain, you can do all sorts of things. There's a special reference about the Watchers arriving and landing on Mount Hermon, and this is the biblical records. And so the Watchers appear to be some different group coming along, but they weren't. They were supporters. They were supporting craftsmen and teachers. In those days, within the royal societies, rather like a village or a town now, a town runs and operates with 150 different craftsmen of different sorts: a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a blacksmith, a stonemason, a carpenter, and on and on and on. And the Watchers were groups of people who all had these individual skills and trainings. So that it was like a complete group of people from a town or a village who then became available to administer the work. And this is how the city-states operated. And so the Watchers essentially were craftsmen and teachers. They were in groups of 10, 50, 100, 200. 200 landed on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared. And they were there to support the whole operation of restarting civilization. And we see this within the city-states. We find this wonderful world of city-states that within a town you have the land all round, you have your main building, which isn't a temple, it's a taimon, or administrative building. Much the same as the early mosques were administrative buildings where people could go to school, medicine, teaching everything that could be taught. Women were playing a major role in the administration and the cooking and the food. And even in the early days of Mesopotamia, we had centralized food at the taimons for the people of the town. It was so well organized. So in order to be able to make that function, you had to distinguish between the different crafts and trades. And fathers had to pass their knowledge to their sons, and sons to theirs, and they built up the trades. So the carpenters and the masons all passed their skills down. We all know about the masons, but there are 120 or 30 other crafts and guilds who operated just like the masons, with this very special knowledge of how things worked. And when a city grew to a certain size, population control being a major issue, that's why women were so much involved, and why women chose who they slept with and when they slept with, and would have wanted to know what the moon cycle was so that they could make decisions about when they were likely to give birth. So the cycles and the astronomy was as much a valuable tool and role for women as they were for the farmers. And so you have a situation where a young man would have had to do his 20 years training, and if he was good enough, he was selected to be a king. And in the ceremony which made him a king, he would have been handed the rod or the ruler, the standard unit of measurement, the rolled measuring tape, and he would have taken those two practical things with him, and 150 craftsmen of all needed and their families, and would have gone there, or even overseas to start another city-state somewhere else. And it's like the egg dividing. It was such a marvellous system. And the king's job was to look after everybody, to make sure everybody was fairly treated. Nobody owned any land because the land was considered to be the property of the gods, and the king was the tenant of the gods. He didn't have any property or value or money. He couldn't be diverted onto things that weren't business. And as we saw this morning in that wonderful clip of the King of Ur taking the shrine of Ninkasag into the marshland in the Mesopotamian plains, and visiting the villages and setting up her chair and her symbols and sitting in it and dispensing justice to the local people, just as our district magistrates did in India for 200 or 300 years, very successfully, 700 people running India with great success. We hear about the bad news, we don't hear about the good news. That's the way it actually worked. There are family trees and genealogies, and more work needs to be done to thoroughly check them on the kind of knowledge that we're now gaining, particularly from proper translation of the ancient records. So it's almost certain that Anu was a perfectly ordinary, clever guy, if you like, who had a wife, maybe more than one wife, we don't know. He would have, he certainly had children. And so the danger has been, of course, is that when somebody is as important as him and had such a major impact as he did, he's then regarded as a god. And what we've done ever since is create our own gods. Man's very good at creating gods. We do it every week on telly, if you look at it in its own particular way. But the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of confusion in most people's mind, because most people want to believe in a God. I want to believe in a God, but not a man, an ordinary human God. I want to think of a super intelligence, a great spirit, and a great spirit who makes this fantastic universe work in the way it does. And if we can plug into nature, as our ancient friends did, and we can plug into each other, and as Confucius says, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Jesus had the same message, and he shrunk it down to reciprocacy. And Henry George, a marvellous American in the 1890s, had the same basic message, that doing unto others as we would have them do unto us wasn't just for the perfection of individuals, but it was also for public bodies, businesses and countries to consider that they should do unto others. And so therefore we have a very important tradition here, which I think we all can learn from if we look at, and not get wrapped up in my God's better than your God, my God says this, my God will do this for you if you're good or bad. These are all horrific man-made muddles which we're having to live with and cope with every day, unnecessarily.
Yes, I think you mentioned in your lecture about the Abrahamic faith being, doesn't it not come from the Anunnaki?
Well, that's right. The line of reasoning behind those comments was that I believe that very many scholars now appreciate that neither Muhammad or Jesus wanted to create a new religion. Their hero was Abraham. So for the Hebrew, the Christian, the Jew, the Arab and Islam, all considered Abraham as the key figure. So that what they were looking at was the Abrahamic faith. And so we need to look, what was the Abrahamic faith? What was Abraham believing in? What did he? So we can do that quite simply by going back to the town that Abraham lived in. And what did everybody do in that town? Well, first of all, we find that they had wonderful laws and they followed the Sumerian system. But we know that all those great cities were destroyed and everything was fragmented, and all our little groups of role societies and leaders and organised structures fell apart. Nobody knew what to do, where to go. And Abraham was appears to be amongst the mercenary class, the military class, because people were soldiers. They had a group of people who were soldiers. All societies put the farmer, who was called a husbandman, or a stockman, or a shepherd, at the top of the hierarchy. And to look after their interests were what are called the artificiers, the people who took the goods from the farmers to make available in the towns and provided the farmers with the things they needed. And the next important class were the soldiers and the military class, who were there to make sure the farmers were not robbed of their land and their crops seized, etc., etc., because agricultural production was absolutely crucial. And the various hierarchies come down the scale. And I'm afraid the public servants, and if you like politicians, were at the bottom of the scale. What we've done in our modern world is turn that upside down and then wonder why we've got problems. So it's an interesting point. Abraham was part of one particular, if you like, part of this role society. And he was even buying and selling land when he arrived in the area of Canaan. And his history is very interesting. We've got, I think, 7 generations going back beyond Abraham, so we've got his family tree. We know where they lived and what they did. So the Abrahamic faith was very closely related to this organised, wonderful Golden Age role society. And Abraham was clearly dispossessed because of great catastrophes and was trying to pick up the pieces in the best way he knew how. We don't mean to denigrate Abraham. It was just that if you wipe out a whole civilization and knock the cities down and global catastrophe, then you've got big problems. And I think, personally, we've been trying to put those problems right ever since. And we haven't known how.
The Druidic faith belief, is that also linked to the Anunnaki?
Yes.
It is.
I read a very important book which I hope everybody will find and read from the local libraries, called St Paul in Britain, by the Reverend R.W. Morgan, dedicated by Connop, Bishop of St David's, and it was written and published in 1860. In my opinion, he had our history wrapped up very well and explained very well, and also explained extremely simply and clearly, without complication, all the great philosophers and the way things worked in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, etc. And so that it's an education on its own. He, being a vicar, considered religion important, but other scholars have made it clear that the Druids it wasn't a religion, the Druid religion, it was a way of doing things. And this is the same as we had in Mesopotamia and Egypt in our Golden Age. It wasn't a religion, it was a way of doing things. We've invented this word religion and it's messed things up. temples weren't temples, they were tamons, administrative buildings primarily. And so this is where the confusion comes in. But we have so much evidence of the links between the Druids and the Tuatha De Nan. And the Tuatha De Nan are the people of the god An, back to our Karsak. And we also find the Druids using the Ogma text, and Ogma goes back to Ogmash, Shamash, back to Uta, who was one of the 7 two-eyed serpents or archangels. So we do have a direct link. And when the Druids, the Druids always said, we are the serpents, we are the Druids. And as we spoke earlier, the word serpent or wise serpent wasn't a snake at all, it was a wise person. And this is where the confusion has come along. And we get the Druids coming into Britain as predominantly long-headed people by the look at it from the graves, coming in round about 4000 BC, when we see the farmers from the Near East coming in with their seeds and farming, particularly where we have an area of side fields on the west coast of Ireland, which was a very large area cleared, was done communally, the fields were rectangular, the walls were built, woods were cleared, fantastic, traditional, if you like, farming operation of livestock and crops. And then the climate got wetter and colder, and the conditions different, and then the peat built up on those field systems, 5-6 feet of peat, and we've dug down and find, God, there's an old farming system underneath all this peat. So climate change, migrations, people moving, the pressures that we have on the planet and have had ever since people have records threaten us enormously, and we can see that within history, and that's where we can learn so much from history, not only as to what went wrong, but can also see great successes and great knowledge, great skills, great technology.